I'm acting chair today of the Halifax Water Board, and welcome to our, well, that's not right, it's not our annual general meeting.
Oh, sorry, my apologies. Let me correct this up, but anyway, yeah.
But before we begin, Halifax Water would like to acknowledge that we are on Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This meeting is open to the public and is streaming live online through the YouTube page at Halifax Water. The agenda and presentations for this meeting are posted on Halifax Water's website. Hard copies are available in the vestibule. And before we begin with the items on the agenda, I have some general information for the benefit of those attending. Gender-neutral washrooms are located out through the meeting room door, turn right through the vestibule door, and then turn left. Bathrooms are on the right-hand side. In the case of an emergency, the exit route is through the main door that you entered when you arrived. If we are required to evacuate the building, the gathering or muster point is at the south end of the parking lot associated with this building. Please look for the black and white muster station sign located on the pole in the back of the parking lot. Please refrain from eating or drinking any food or beverage except for water. There is water in cups available in the back of the room. We also request that you please refrain from talking while the presentations are underway. Also, please ensure your phones and other devices are set to silence or quiet mode. I'm done.
Coffee allowed?
Following the presentations, there will be an opportunity for members of the public to ask questions of Halifax Water staff members and members of the board. Any member of the public who is disruptive, I'm watching, to this meeting will be asked to stop, and if the disruption persists, the person will be asked to leave and escorted out by the commissioner. I'll now call the meeting to order and begin with the approval of business, or the minutes.
Agenda.
Well, we'd rather go first to the ratification of the in-camera. So I'll ask for a motion to move and the ratification of the in-camera.
I so moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
As reminded, motion is passed. Approval of the order of business. Are there any additions or deletions to the agenda?
Yes.
Mr. Farquhar?
I move that we add item 5-I, disclosure of a lead service line and testing information reports to the agenda.
I will add it after number 7 so that it's in connection with that same topic.
Thank you.
So we will add 5-I after 7 on the agenda. Are there any other additions or deletions? Seeing none, I'll ask for the approval of the order of business. In a motion,
So moved, as amended.
and seconded by Farquhar. All in favor? We have an agenda. Approval of the minutes of the regular meeting of Thursday, September 26th and October 31st, 2019. A motion to move the minutes, if you're in agreement with them.
I so moved.
Colleen, seconded by Councilor Zarowski. All in favor? The minutes have passed. Business arising from the minutes, it's blank. There is nothing, Madam Clerk. Financials, 4.1, operating results for the 7 months ended October 31st. We have 10 minutes, according to the agenda.
Excuse me, Louis DeMopprin, I'm the Director of Corporate Services and CFO.
You might need to speak up, Louis.
I'll try to speak up.
Okay.
Just a quick update in terms of where we are. We provide quite a detailed report that's here. There's lots of additional schedules attached on the different way we do our accounting. We do have 2 approaches, one that we use for the UARB to set our rates, and a second related to the IFRS, which is the technical accounting rules that we're required to complete our financial statement. So we give sort of both versions. I'll just run through the UARB ones at a high level, just because those are the most directly impactful to us. Just on page 2, we have sort of a very high level consolidated income statement. As a highlight on the operating revenue side, we have seen water consumption go up at approximately 0.3%, so a little higher than we normally have. Wastewater consumption, our revenue has increased by approximately $100,000. Some of that is offset by an adjustment that we made in the previous year related to our wastewater rebate, so that impacts the numbers that you're seeing there. On the expenditure side, our expenses are about $4.1 million higher than last year, which is to be expected based on the way we are budgeted and our costs in terms of their escalation from year to year. The other main area that I wanted to highlight is in the non-operating expenses primarily. We've seen our depreciation decrease by about $600,000 from last year. It's offset by, sort of further affected by a reduction of about $1.5 million on our debt servicing costs, primarily related to the older debt that we have paid off. The other part that offsets that is an increase in our pension expenses. They've increased approximately $2.3 million related to the actuarial changes that we made through the actuarial review that was done at the beginning of the year. So we've seen those costs hit in this period. On page 3, we talked a little bit about our balance sheet. Our cash position continues to be healthy. Our current ratios are in an acceptable range. Our receivables, payables are consistent with where they are in previous years, so there's nothing significant there that we need to look at. On the debt side, our debt continues to decrease. In November, we refinanced, or we added approximately $30 million in new debt, which came to the board. So we've received that money that will impact and increase our cash balance going forward and increase our liability on the debt side. We have a little bit of information there about our assets under construction, and I think that's fairly consistent with what we would have provided in our last update. And if there's any further questions, there's lots of additional information there if people are interested.
Are there any questions, Louis? I don't see any, and there is no motion on the floor, so we will go to the signing authority guideline for point 2.
And I'm going to speak to that, Madam Chair. Heidi Shedler, Corporate Secretary to the Board. This item is coming before the Board today for approval. It is our signing authority guideline that has been in place. This document generally has been in place here at Halifax Water for a number of years, and today we're just looking to update it. So I will say to start that in the body of the memo attached to the actual signing authority, I did make reference to 2 attachments. I had initially thought that I might include a red line attachment, but it got very confusing. And so I eliminated that, but I forgot to eliminate that reference in the report, so I apologize for that. So the guideline is attached to the memo. Ultimately, it is just an update, and so we wanted to make sure that the appropriate levels were reflected in who should be approving various things. And this guideline is specifically for signing authority, so the authority to sign contracts, to sign and bind Halifax Water from a legal perspective from in various ways. And ultimately, unless there's any questions, that is really all I can say.
Are there any questions? Colleen?
I just had a question about expenses, and you may have referred to it in the fact you're talking about signing authority. There's a category for travel, but it doesn't really outline maybe more general expenses. So I was wondering where a general expense might fit in the approvals for that if it's not travel related.
So Halifax Water does have a financial approvals list that was put before the board, I believe, earlier this year for approval and update. I think it was probably in September, if I remember correctly. And that is more on the expenses side of things. And so that document sets out various financial thresholds and assigns positions within Halifax Water to those thresholds. And so that is dealt with under a separate issue. But it's all part and parcel of this financial oversight.
Did I answer my question?
Are there any other questions?
We may be able to just expand the heading from travel to travel and expenses, or because some of the items down below are say travel and claims and reimbursements, so it may be that we can expand it slightly there.
So I think it's important to distinguish here on the travel piece of it that it's not just about the financial piece of the travel. That approval for the travel, so for example for the general manager, is about approving in general the fact that the general manager would be traveling to a particular event from an expense perspective, but then also there's various other pieces that might fold into that as far as a consideration. And so there are a few levels, but if you wanted to add something there to make it a bit clearer, that could be added.
It just says the signing authority guideline as shown is in the attachments, and that's the attachment, so there really is nothing to amend in the motion per se, just something for you two to figure out. Okay, so can someone put the motion on the floor?
I move that the Halifax Water Board approve the signing authority guidelines as shown in the attachment.
A seconder, please. Second by Councillor Hensby. All in favor? Contrary minded? Motion is passed. Capital approvals, we're allotting 20 minutes. 5.1, capital project spending summary. Who's speaking to that?
I think I'll call Jamie Hannum, our Director of Engineering Information Services, to come up and speak to that if you have any questions. But this is essentially our annual summary of, for our open capital projects, what's completed over or under budget. Once the board approves this, it's something that we also file with the Nova Scotia Utility Review Board. If you have any questions related to any individual specific project, then Jamie would be able to answer them.
The only thing I would add, there's two attachments. One is all capital work orders closed as of the end of last fiscal year, and the second is a subset report that's geared towards subsequently sending it to the URB, which is all projects that also had URB approval, generally projects over $250,000 in value. So it's just a subset of the first that we would send to the URB specifically on closure of projects that they had specifically approved.
And they're both identified as attachment 2.
Nope, there's attachment 1 and 2. One is
Okay,
all
so we'll
closed
need to
work orders.
change that in the motion.
If I'm correct, Jamie, that would be 5.1 and 5.2 on the agenda?
Capital 5.2 is a separate report.
Separate report?
Yeah, Capital 5.1 is just the
Yeah, I think
project
this is
spending
probably just
summary.
we need clarity on the reference. Attachment 1 is the all closed work orders. Attachment 2 is the subset of over $250,000 work orders. So I think the recommendation should read as for attachment 1 and 2.
1 and 2.
Thank you for clarifying. So I believe you're speaking now?
No?
Unless you have questions.
Question on any individual items.
Does anyone have, Colleen?
So there was just a few projects that sort of doubled in magnitude. I didn't know if you could speak to those. One was the Aerotech wastewater treatment membrane bioreactor.
By pointing to it on the long
So
spreadsheet, or is it on attachment 2?
No, well, I found it on attachment 1, I think second project down, page 1.
Yeah. Okay, so there was a project budget of $25,000 and a $62,000 expenditure. That initially was generated to do preliminary design work for the membrane bioreactor, which was a core component of the Aerotech wastewater treatment plant. So this would have just been the design work that actually incurred with that. All of these costs were then generally rolled up into the total Aerotech wastewater treatment plant project. So it would have just been an over expenditure in design fees. So relative to the $25 million total project cost, just some minor cost allocation within the preliminary design process where we didn't go back and adjust the budget allocation because there was other design components to it.
So on attachment 2, can you speak to, I don't know if it's the same formality, the column headings have total project budget and then project adjustments?
Yep.
So is that what would have happened on Aerotech? what triggers a project adjustment?
So that would be the,
Just sort of as a general question.
yeah, so in this table, what we note is if there's often a project gets one for sure or more capital funding requests. So often we'll go to a project and get approval for the design phase, and then we may come back and get approval for the construction phase, and then we may come back for a third time if there's some over expenditure based on costs incurred during construction. So there could be up to 3 approvals on a given project, and those would show up on this table as the project adjustments, which would then result in the revised total project budget. So often it's because of a 2-stage delivery, design and construction, and often it's because of over expenditures on a project based on tender results or change orders on the project.
You good? Anyone else? Councillor Hansby?
On the bottom of the first page of 1 of 7, the lead line service replacement for 18-19, showing it's over budget by over $500,000. We'll be discussing this matter later on today. I'm just kind of curious about that. Would there be any, depending on how our decision later today goes, will that affect that over budget requirement in regards to will we be assuming any assets to be probably become more of an asset for write-off versus or depreciation?
So what's shown in capital here for lead service line program is the public portion, which Halifax Water budgets for. What we're discussing later today are enhancements to lead service line replacement on the private side, which actually don't flow through our capital budget. They flow through the operating budget right now because they're assets.
Individual project over expenditures identified in attachment 1 and 2, and capital project spending summary April 1st, 2018 to March 31st, 2019, and direct staff to forward the subset of projects of over $250,000 to the Nova Scotia Utility Review Board for information and approval.
Second by Councillor Zarowski. All in favor? Contrary-minded? Motion passed. 5.2, capital project funding approval policy.
So this is a report that we're bringing forward to you because the the Public Utilities Act has been amended to change the capital approval limit for utilities. And essentially, in the past, anything over $250,000 had to go to the URB for approval. Now that threshold has increased to $1 million. We're proposing to adjust our capital funding policy thresholds to align ourselves with that new change with the Nova Scotia Utility and Review Board. So what that means essentially is there's a subset of projects that would have been going to the URB that now don't go to the URB that are within the general manager's approval authority.
Any questions?
Yes, Madam Chair, in regards to that increase from $250,000 to $1 million, would that also reflect the signing authorities for the general manager, or would there still be some requirement of board approvals? I just wanted to make sure that we're not have to report to the URB, but we still have to do our funding criteria and stuff.
So the signing authority document that you previously approved deals with authorization level for a variety of different transactions. So right now for the general manager, the authorization for transactions is laid out in the signing authority. Financial expenditure authority for like authorizing invoices, check requests is in the financial authority document. And this is capital project funding authority, which is another separate document. The general manager can approve execution of contracts, for example, of up to $5 million if it's an item that's got all of the other proper, it's had the funding approval, it's gone through the proper procurement policy, the board has approved it. What is contemplated here is really what is the authority level for the general manager and the board for capital projects in different situations. So if they're already budgeted and they're approved as part of the mass budget, or if there are things that are coming along outside the budget cycle. Anything you want to add to that? Or?
No, it's quite clear in terms of where those first approvals happen, and the step-by-step is outlined in the various sections.
Thank you.
Any further questions? We put the motion on the floor already.
I move that the Halifax Water Board approve the revised capital budget funding approval policy dated 1st November 2019 as attached.
Second.
Second by Ted. All in favor? Contrary-minded? Motion's passed.
So if I could just provide some information here. The next three reports are capital projects that would normally have come to the board, but because now the capital project funding approval policy has been approved, you have the option. The general manager could approve these now, and you could choose not to discuss them, or you can proceed under the pre-existing capital funding approval policy and approve them at this board meeting for now. But those are examples of the type of items that would no longer be coming to the board as a result of the capital funding approval policy. So really, it's the board's choice how you deal with them
And
today.
I was just gonna change up the fact that we should be putting the motion on the floor before we even discuss the matter. So now we can actually move all three of them together because it's part and parcel with what you've already moved. So if somebody would be willing to move all three of those motions, 5.3, 5.4, and 5.5.
If we do that, can we discuss one of them?
Yeah. It's your prerogative.
Madam Chair, I'll move that the Halifax Water Board approve the additional funding of $60,000 for the 450 Cowie Hill heating, ventilation, air conditioning control upgrade project for the revised total cost of $285,000. Furthermore, be it resolved that the Halifax Water Board approved the budget increase for this project at an estimated increase of $170,000 for the revised total project cost estimated of $410,000. That's for the Security IT Foundations project. And thirdly, that the Halifax Water Board approve additional funding in the amount of $206,000 for the Lake Major Water Supply Plant New Alum Tank project for a revised estimated total of $340,000.
A seconder, please. Colleen, now you may speak to us.
Madam Chair, I was kind of curious with the Lake Major project. The report talks about there's an estimated 26 years of life remaining in the existing tanks. I'm just kind of curious of what additional years we anticipate in gaining of replacing this tank if we have basically a quarter of a century still remaining in that current tank. Why bother replacing it now?
Good question. The clarity is that the original assumed scope at preliminary design was to replace the two existing tanks because they were approaching the end of their useful life and add a net new third tank because of the increased demand for that line of the treatment process. During the design process, there was these analytics done on the tank that basically said there was reasonable useful life left in the first two tanks. Thus, we are not replacing the first two tanks, and the project now is just to add the net third tank because of the information we found during the design life we aren't replacing the first two. We're going to extend the life by something upwards of 26 years, re-examine those in the next 5 or 10 years, and this project becomes simply to put one net new tank in. So we've actually reduced the scope based on the results of the information we gathered during design.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions on the motion on the floor?
This one on the original cost for the new aluminum tank. Budget was $155,000 previously. Was that for, and that was to replace two and add a third one? Or was that just like the design phase?
Yeah, that was to do the preliminary design and the investigative work on the tanks, referring back to my previous comments about often two-stage process where we don't know the scale of the capital investment on construction until we do pre-design. So we presumptive to seek the larger dollar value, so we requested sufficient funds to do preliminary design and analysis. And then with that analysis, came back with a more specific number, which is the number today.
And so we're modifying the scope to do the design and the replacement as well? For the third, I mean, sorry, not replacement, the addition of the third tank.
Right, so the net new third tank had always been in scope.
Yeah.
What had been in the original scope was an assumed replacement of those two tanks based on end of life. But when we did the actual on-site analytics, they showed a significant remaining useful life.
Okay, but the reason for the increase is because
Well,
we're in construction as well?
Yeah, the increase to the project is we're going to the construction phase. The reality is it's a smaller increase than we may have been here had we were putting 3 new tanks in.
Thank you, that clarifies. Very good.
Any further clarification? I'll call for the question. All in favor? Contrary-minded? The motion is passed.
Number 6, under other, integrated resource plan. Make yourself comfortable, it's allotting 60 minutes.
So we're going to call forward 2 Halifax Water team members, Valerie Williams, who's the manager of our asset management group, and Heather Miller, who's an engineer who's been working hard on the integrated resource plan update for probably 2 years now. So they're going to provide a presentation that will give you a bit of an executive summary of the materials that are within your board package.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and board members. I'm Val Williams, I'm the manager of asset management. I'm going to give just a little bit of an overview of where we started with our whole integrated resource plan back in 2012, and then I'll pass it on to Heather Miller, who will talk about all her work on the recent update to the IRP. So the first thing I wanted to share with everybody is what exactly is integrated resource planning. There are multiple definitions out in the industry. So when we started our refresh of the IRP, we chose to redefine what it means to Halifax Water. So effectively, we're looking at 3 primary drivers: growth, asset renewal, and compliance, and how that impacts our 3 infrastructure systems, water, wastewater, stormwater, over the long term. In terms of integration, that means bringing in all of the things that may influence the capital spend over that planning horizon. In typical good long-term planning means we have a look at all of the factors that would influence the decisions we make along the planning cycle. So, for example, what assumptions have we got? What regulatory compliance matters might we have to consider? All of our assumptions around growth, and all of those things are evaluated at the outset of the project so that we're starting fresh with brand new assumptions and a nice starting point. And the final output is really our long-term capital investment plan. So some of you may have already seen some of these graphics before. This is from the 2012 IRP. The $2.6 billion over 30 years was the overall expenditure that we had projected. It's largely divided into those three compliance, growth, and asset renewal drivers. The bulk of that was under asset renewal, and then almost an equal split between growth and compliance. In terms of which infrastructure systems we were talking about, the majority of that original fund was for the wastewater, very small sliver on the stormwater piece, and then about a quarter of the amount on the water infrastructure. we look at the projected 2012 long-term plan, it was showing us that the need for about 130 million annually as a sustainable level of investment. Obviously, there's peaks and valleys along the way, depending on the needs of a given year. When we started out just before the 2012 IRP, we were roughly around the $50 million mark. We are now, probably if you look at that graph, around year 7 now. We're actually around the 90 million, approaching the 90 million mark in terms of where we sit in our capital budgeting right now. So we are gradually moving towards that sustainable level. In terms of recommendations coming out of the IRP, the 2012 IRP, a big piece was recognition that we had a lot of areas to improve our data, some data gaps that needed to actually collect the information. We needed to reconcile data that was already in our data set that maybe was questionable or not as reliable, so we spent a fair amount of effort since that time collecting that information. One of the other recommendations was to have a more formalized corporate flow monitoring program that is used for calibrating our hydraulic models and understanding a better situation pre and post of any kind of capital work that we put in play. We suggested the implementation of a wet weather management program, and probably all are aware that we do have a very active wet weather management program now. Completing a water and wastewater master plan, so sort of formalizing our whole long-term planning approach and having a more systematic approach to what we're doing so that we are better prepared for the future. We had started our asset management program. It was really literally in its infancy when we started the IRP, so it was a recognition that we were on that path and it was time for us to move that forward, try and implement more of our asset management program. And then the other piece that was a recommendation was to look at climate change and how climate change impacts may influence the way that we are planning for the future, and then how can we integrate that into our master planning approach. And with that, I will pass it on to my colleague Heather.
So when we were looking at doing the update to the 2012 integrated resource plan, we really kind of sat back and said, what do we want the 2019 plan to look like? And we really wanted a defensible, optimized, integrated solution where we took all of our inputs and considered them together, not in isolation. We wanted to provide further clarity on our drivers, so compliance, asset renewal, and growth, and really develop a cost-effective long-term plan. You can see from this figure here in the pinkish color, we have our integrated resource plan, but all the other circles around it are the inputs. So every time we go back and go through our full planning cycle for the integrated resource plan, we have a lot better information. Val alluded to all the work that we've done developing our knowledge on our asset management knowledge on all of our infrastructure. So that comes out of our what do we know about our water system, wastewater system, stormwater system, and then also developing our hydraulic models through inputs from our flow monitoring program. Then we have the master plans that we worked on the water and wastewater so those are referred to as our infrastructure master plans. And so all of this feeds into developing our long-term plan, our short 5-year plan, which you will see some elements of the IRP in our capital budget, our long-term 30-year projection, and then also recommendations on how do we fill those data gaps that we've noticed each year and at each iteration. So really our vision was to build on the good work that we did through the 2012 IRP, take our lessons learned over the last five-ish years, and where can we move forward. We wanted to align our infrastructure inputs and recommendations, so that was taking information from our compliance plan, our infrastructure master plan, and our asset management plans and bring those together. We really wanted to plan strategically for the long term and have implementable steps in the short term. What do we need to do over the next 5 years to get ourselves ready for the next either infrastructure master plan update or the integrated resource plan update coming after that. So that's the work that when we started out what we wanted this program to be. Val talked about the drivers. So building on the 2012 IRP, we kept with the same drivers: compliance, asset renewal, and growth. The 2012 IRP also talked to 14 objectives. So we pulled those objectives forward to this update.
we took a look at them and said, where have things changed, where can we do some minor updates? So you'll see that we've made some changes, minor changes to them. You'll notice that climate change kind of is sprinkled through a lot of the different objectives under each driver. So that brings us to our little piece on climate change. You can't go anywhere without hearing about the importance of climate change and what everybody is doing for it. So really, climate change was layered into the three, in particular the infrastructure master plan and the compliance plan that were brought into the IRP. Through the infrastructure master plan, we developed a vulnerability to climate change assessment framework. We will be taking that forward over the next few months and next 2 years actually, and implementing those assessments. So that's taking a look at our infrastructure by asset class and where are we vulnerable to climate change. So it's more than just looking at increased rainfall and sea level rise. What happens if we have major snowstorms, long power outages, big windstorms? How does that impact our infrastructure? How do we access our infrastructure? How do we operate it? So it's taking more of a holistic look at things.
That's the IDF curves, what's?
You'll have a chance to ask questions after. Just write it down and then.
David is here to answer that.
All right.
Carry on, Heather.
So we also, through the infrastructure master plan, took a look at assessing the individual projects using a new design rainfall that made an allowance for the predicted increases due to rainfall intensities. And we also considered the impacts of sea level rise. So there's a lot of talk about what's going to happen in Halifax and Dartmouth as sea level rise happens. So we did take a look. We considered what should we be considering for sea level rise and what impact would that have on our infrastructure. We are proposing changes to our design criteria that is published through our regulatory services department. That is an update to the IDF curves where there is an increase in rainfall intensity. So that's about a 16% increase.
Intensity, duration, frequency.
I'm not sure if that helps you, but we can get into further discussions on that later.
For the record, you can repeat that.
IDF stands for intensity, duration, and frequency.
Thank you.
And then also, what impacts are we going to see? So when a project is proposed that there's changes to our infrastructure that we know is going to be within the limits of sea level rise, what impact does that have on our level of service? How does that change how we are going to have to operate those particular assets in the future? Our compliance plan also took a look at impacts that we are already experiencing due to climate change. One example of that would be lake recovery. So this is a comparison of the 2012 integrated resource plan to where we are in 2019. You'll see the total program cost in 2012 dollars was just about $3.9 billion. And then the net present value was $2.6 billion. I think a lot of the information that we have shared was regarding the net present value number, so that 2.6. When you look at the 2019 IRP, we're looking at just over $4 billion total program cost and a net present value of $2.7 billion. So there really isn't that much of a difference when you compare them that way between the 2012 integrated resource plan and the 2019 plan. You can see the division between the drivers. You'll notice that there's been an increase in the asset renewal expenditure or the asset renewal allocation from the 2012. A lot of this is due to having better information about our assets. We've been able to fill a lot of those data gaps that Val talked about previously. And our average expenditure in 2012 was $131 million, and now we're looking at an annual expenditure of $135 million. So we talked a little bit about the inputs to the infrastructure master plan. There are 4 inputs. The 3 big ones are the integrated resource plan. The 4 big ones are the infrastructure master plan, compliance plan, or asset management plans, and then just our corporate programs that are capitalized. So the infrastructure master plan is a program that services growth for the next 30 years out to 2046. It looks at our wastewater and water infrastructure. This also informs the regional development charge that we talked about last month during the special board meeting. You can see that although the infrastructure master plan is driven mainly by growth, it does touch the other drivers through asset renewal and compliance. Our compliance plan focuses on our wastewater and water infrastructure and ensuring that we are compliant with current regulations that are there and potential future ones that are known to us. It documents our long-term 30-year infrastructure needs. And again, this program touches also on a little bit on growth and asset renewal along with compliance. So our asset management plan, we have 14 asset classes that we look at. It takes a look at all of our asset inventory and the replacement costs for each of those asset classes. This driver is 100% asset renewal. You can see that there's an allocation between water, wastewater, and stormwater. Our corporate programs cover anything to do with our IT infrastructure, land, security, equipment, fleet, that comes under that category. And again, there is a split between our three drivers. So once we took all four of those programs, we went into a process of how do we integrate all this information to come up with one long-term integrated resource plan program. So we really put all of those four categories together. So what is flexible? What can be moved? What can we change kind of timelines and start dates for? Whether that's based on growth or are there other asset renewal projects in the area that we can take some advantage of. So we put those together, integrated projects for timing. A lot of it, if we knew that there was a growth project in a certain area and we were able to pick up some asset renewal replacement projects along the way, that's how we tried to align the program. So then we're coming into step 4 and we produced our fully integrated program. Then we went into a step where we were smoothing our program. How do we smooth out the cash flow? So we do know that we have some large expenditures, some big projects, and that's not all going to happen in one fiscal year. So it's separating things out. I think Jamie talked about it a little bit earlier into the design stage and construction stage. So how do we spread that over a few year period to develop a realistic plan? Other things where we took in smoothly, we know at a number of our wastewater treatment facilities, Dartmouth and Halifax in particular, by 2040 we're going to have to meet the wastewater system effluent requirement guidelines. We're not going to upgrade or do work at both of those facilities over the same time. So how do we stage the work that needs to be done to meet those incoming regulations in 2040? And then we have our final program. So this is just a quick snapshot that you can see of our program. It is in the back of the executive summary that has all of our projects. I think there's over 250 projects listed there. You can just see from this graph that we do identify the source, whether they came from the infrastructure master plan, the compliance plan, or our asset management plans, or even through the corporate program. You can see what region they're in, the cost, how we split the driver allocation as well. So taking a complete look at the 2009 Integrated Resource Program, you can see here we've done the pie charts by drivers, but then also by system type. So 68% of our investment will be in asset renewal, 14% in growth, 18% in compliance. And then when you switch to look at what does our investment look like on our systems, so our water, wastewater, and stormwater systems, it's 36% in water, 55% in wastewater, and 9% in stormwater. This is a look at the 30-year program, and you can see orange is asset renewal, green is growth, the blue is compliance, and with our average spend of $135 million. You can see there are spikes within the program depending on just the timing of certain projects. So overall, the 2019 IRP has 32 recommendations. I'd say at the highest level, one is implement the program that is in the IRP. There's also some that make sure that we continue our long-term planning process and we're updating these feeder studies on a 5-year cycle. And then again with our asset management program is like continue to gain knowledge about our assets through condition and performance assessments. A big piece is integrating or further integrating our private side inflow and infiltration program with our wet weather management program. Through the regional development charge, there's a lot of work proposed through our infrastructure master plan around the removal of inflow and infiltration from our system. And I think we're going to have to look at our private side program and integrate that further with our wet weather management program to achieve those targets that we've set. Continue to update and maintain our hydraulic model, enhance our cost estimation approach in the future, and then also enhance coordination of our capital project team. And we are going to have to meet that target over time of the $135 million. We are going to have to increase our capital delivery, either through staffing or improving the methodology that we use to deliver projects. And then continue to work on and enhance our relationship with Nova Scotia Environment. This is really so that we are aware, and our staff does an excellent job of that already, aware of upcoming compliance changes to the regulations that would impact the compliance plan, and then again, working closer with HRM, and that's through our population projections that we need to develop our growth plans. So our next step, we provided the board with our executive summary. There's a larger document that goes behind that with all of the details, so we're just in the process of finalizing that document and getting all the necessary reviews on it. We will keep projects that are moving forward and going through for federal funding. We will look at those from a climate change adaptation and mitigation opportunities, so that's through the climate lens when we need to get infrastructure funding. And then also, we will be filing the IRP in the future with any necessary applications that are moving through to the UARB. And that's it.
Councilor Kowalski, would you like to put the motion on the floor and then speak to it?
Yes, if I can find the motion. Somebody has it for me here. Thank you. I move that Halifax Water Board endorse the 2019 Halifax Water Integrated Resource Plan.
Second it, please. Second it. Ted, Colleen, one of them. Go ahead.
Okay, I am so pleased that someone said climate change before I did. I think
There's a lot of that going around.
there seems to be a lot of it going around. And I'm so pleased that we are recognizing that mitigation, adaptation, all of that needs to go in there. So I'm going to ask a few questions about it. In light of the gap report that came out from the IPCC on Tuesday, saying that we're in Canada, on average, between 30 and 50% below where we need to be. When we plan to do something, what are our outcomes? Like, where are we expecting to go, and what are the dates of this? As we look at adapting to climate change, are we measuring our CO2 footprint, our energy output, and where do we want to get to? I'd like to see sort of goals, saying we're here, this is where we intend to be in X number of years, and this is how much it's going to cost. Second question, do they align with HRM Halifax 2050 of zero net emissions by 2050? And third, where are we getting our data from? I know that Environment Canada and Climate Change Canada is trying to stay on top of things, but with each additional report I see coming out of the IPCC, we're falling short. We seem to be, we have to update our statistics. And so do we put the error bounds in there? Because I'd like us to be successful. So those are the three questions.
Okay, please respond.
I'm going to turn around to our staff representative, who is on the Halifax committee.
Wonderful.
Halifax Water. That he may be able to address number 2 and number 3, I think.
I'll try number 1.
Okay.
You may pull your chair up to the table.
So, I think your first question was really related to what are our targets when it comes from greenhouse gas emission reduction.
Bingo.
Yeah. So Halifax Water does have an energy management plan and a subcommittee of staff who meet to plan the projects. And we do track our energy use, our greenhouse gas emission reductions, and associated cost savings from those energy management projects also. I will say that that energy management reduction plan, in terms of targets, has not been realigned to reflect what's coming out of Halifax or coming out of other policy directions. One of the things we have to bear in mind is that a zero net target for Halifax Water would be very hard to achieve because we're essentially an industrial type entity, and in order to produce safe drinking water and to produce wastewater effluent that's safe and meeting regulations, we're going to be consuming a certain amount of energy. We're an energy intensive organization. That being said, I think we have made big headway since the energy management plan has been in place. I'd say that's been in place, and I'm looking to Jamie to correct me if I'm wrong, but it's probably been in place for at least 6 years.
Yeah, I'd say even a little bit longer, yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and achieving reductions every year, but that's one that hasn't come back to the board in a long time. So when we bring our 5-year business plan in January to the board, you will see what's under that plan for targets and projects for the next 5 years, and we can also discuss it at the board governance workshop if there needs to be some discussion of adjusting a target for the organization.
I'm David Blades. I'm the infrastructure program manager working on the team with Heather and Val, so providing a bit of technical support. And you might just have to refresh me a little bit. I think question 3 was related to where the data came from, and question 2 was...
That was question 3. Question 2 is what are our targets as they exist currently? So what are we targeting for? Do we have hard targets saying that in 5 years we expect to be here, in 10 years we expect to be here, in 30 years we expect to be here? So is our planning just to reduce, and if so, what are the outcomes, and then of course do they conform with the IPCC, which in part you've answered.
Yeah, I think sort of speaking to what Kathy said as well, that the goal right now, there aren't fixed or set goals, but everything was looked at through a lens of when developing the infrastructure strategy to avoid creating new pumping stations or new processes that would push us in the wrong direction in either energy consumption or in greenhouse gas generation. Speaking more to where the data came from, so specific to this project, or in the infrastructure master plan project, we convened a workshop with some local to Canada experts in the area of climate change. So through the consultant that we work with, GM Blue Plan, they brought together a team that was from Climate Action, I believe, and Wood Consulting. Yes. So they had somebody who was an expert in sea level rise, and in somebody else who was an expert in sourcing data for intensification of rainfall and increase in global temperature and where you might look at getting data from. So we've, I think we've generally stuck with Canadian sources, but drawn from a wide base of studies around work that's been done at Dow for sea level rise, through Riel Daigle, who was also with Environment Canada, and developed the Atlantic Canada, sorry, the name of the report kind of escapes me right now, but when Environment Canada looked at climate change in Atlantic Canada, he was the lead on that. And but I think we've generally tried to stick close to the IPCC guidelines and the ensemble modeling and that sort of thing that's been done through that.
I guess when I hear the word "he's an expert," the hair on the back of my neck starts to stand up, because you can find experts in the Cato Institute and the Fraser Institute and the Atlantic Institute of Market Studies who will fashion themselves under that. So
What's wrong with that?
we'll mud wrestle over that later on, David. I guess I am looking for something much more robust, quite frankly. And as Ms. O'Toole has said, we will have an opportunity to address that coming up. I'm also looking for costs associated with this, the good, bad, and ugly. The hard fact remains that the GAP report is saying it is going to cost to address climate change, and it's going to cost much more if we don't. And I think we have to begin to get on that footing, to begin to address it that way, and to be really familiar with where we're getting our information from. Environment Canada in general is a laggard. In Nova Scotia, we fall in the middle of the pack based on a number of things. So I'm sorry to lecture, but we're not, in my humble opinion, not nearly there. So I look forward to hoping that in the next few months we can increase our game and start addressing things in a meaningful way. So thank you.
If I could add to my earlier response, the only two board-approved targets for us right now, one is under our corporate balance scorecard, under environmental stewardship. It's a measure of basically our energy intensiveness associated with our energy management. So it's the kilowatt hours consumed divided by the cubic meters of production. So basically that's the percent energy reduction associated with our capital projects. Each year when the business plan comes forward, there's a number of capital projects that are related to energy initiatives. And in our business plan, there's a targeted greenhouse gas emission reduction associated with that suite of projects. But as we discussed earlier, there's no like, this is the 10-year target, this is the 20-year target. It's more a planning cycle target that's coming out of the annual business planning cycle and the annual corporate balance scorecard.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, you want to add
Sorry, can I add
something?
something as well? Yeah. I spoke mostly previously around mitigation, but we're also coming out of the infrastructure master plan this fiscal year, starting vulnerability to climate change assessments, which is a project which is in the current capital budget, and we plan to run as a program over the next number of years, looking broadly across the asset classes to get an understanding of what our gap is, our vulnerabilities to climate change, and what the gap of those assets are. And Heather kind of spoke to it a little bit in her presentation as well.
Thank you. I appreciate this.
Other, Colleen? No? Ted?
I'll just make a comment, just say thank you very much. Doing something like this is really hard. It's a lot of work. You know, I've worked in companies where we're kind of doing these things piecemeal. We're not looking out more than 5 years. So to do a 30-year plan and integrate everything shows a lot of forward thinking, and I'm really happy about that. So thank you very much for that.
No one else?
I had a sidebar conversation prior to the meeting, given the day that we have today outside, and was just asking, so you mentioned about, the vulnerability and looking at the assessments into the future, and I just said, are we looking at, you said earlier that you're looking at design criteria, but then are the standards looking to be changed when it comes to stormwater? Because at the end of the day, the water has to go somewhere, so to prevent flooding, you're going to need to have bigger pipes underground to handle that water, and I just wondered if that's something that you're putting into place now.
Yes, so we did look specifically at sea level rise and rainfall as part of the climate change work that was done as part of this. And right now, our design and construction standards are published I think on a biannual basis is the plan going forward, and I'm expecting that the draft recommendations that we made for those will be in the 2020 specification in January, which is to increase by 16% the IDF curves that are used for design.
Okay. Because to Councillor Zarowski's point, the federal government has called it and everyone has agreed that we're in a climate change crisis. So when you're in a crisis, you want to start seeing things implemented that much sooner, like that's to that point. So I'll call for the question. All in favor? Contrary minded? Motion is passed. On to number 7, lead service line replacement program. I'll ask for someone to put the motion on the floor, then we can speak to it. Okay, Colleen.
I move that the Halifax Water Board authorize staff to make an application to the Nova Scotia Utility Review Board as part of the next general rate application to amend the rules and regulations to enhance the lead service line replacement program. The proposed changes are intended to enable Halifax Water to meet its goals for lead service line replacement by 2050 by integrating with HRM street renewal projects and by replacing the portion of lead service lines on private property at utility expense.
A seconder? Ed, thank you. Can they speak? You have nothing to, are they presenting?
Yes, I'm going to introduce them. So
Okay.
we've allowed a significant amount of time on the agenda today for
I
this
didn't want to
important
point
topic.
that out.
Halifax Water has been working on this suite of a proposed enhancement for the lead service line program for quite a while, based on the experience we have operating our current lead service line replacement program. And here to speak to it today are Reed Campbell, our Director of Water Services, and Wendy Kosick, who is our Water Quality Manager.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
We're already excited, by the way.
Yeah, it's been a lot of work. We're very pleased to be here. So you have a recommendation before you, and we're going to make a not too long presentation. I think it's probably useful to provide the board members some background on lead in drinking water, where we've come over the last few years. Talk about the program that we've had over the last 3 or 4 years approved by this board, how that's been going, and what we see as the barriers going forward, and how we intend to tackle that. So I think it's fairly well known that lead is a concern. It's a public health concern. There's all kinds of respected agencies like Health Canada, Centers for Disease Control, US EPA have taken the position that exposure to any level of lead is inappropriate. Water that we produce in our water treatment plants, like most utilities, is lead-free. There's no lead in the drinking water that comes out of the treatment plants, and all the way almost to the customer's home, there's no lead in drinking water. But the source of lead in drinking water is shown on the slide. There's 3 sources. There's the lead service that connects the water main in the street to the home. Up till the mid-1950s in Halifax, lead was the material of choice for those service lines. There's lead tin solder used in plumbing, and there's lead in brass plumbing fixtures. Lead tin solder was banned in 1986 in Canada, although I'm told if you look really hard in some plumbing stores, you can find lead tin solder. And there are now standards for lead-free brass, but once again, it is possible to purchase plumbing fixtures that have leaded brass. In Halifax, our situation is if we encounter a home with a high level of lead, typically there's a lead service line involved, and typically when we get rid of the lead service line, the problem goes away. So that speaks to the fact we also do corrosion control treatment at the water supply plant, and that is effective in managing any lead that we find in solder or in plumbing fixtures. And I'll also add, in North America, we've done a very good job of minimizing the other sources of environmental lead. So lead in the atmosphere from gas, leaded paints. So as a consequence, when we do encounter, we've not encountered problems this way in Halifax, but when public health people encounter children or other people with high blood lead levels, typically exposure to drinking water is a major source of that because we've done such a good job of getting rid of other sources of lead. So in Halifax, this is the typical situation for utilities in North America. The service line connects the water main in the street to the home. It's typically 3/4 inches or 1 inch in diameter. Halifax Water owns the portion that goes from the water main in the street to the valve that's near the property line. And the customer owns the portion that goes from that valve near the property line into the water meter. And so when we're replacing that, there's 2 assets involved, the one owned by Halifax Water and the one owned by the customer. Halifax Water and the Service Commission of Dartmouth Water Utility have been replacing lead service lines since the 1970s. In the 1970s, the Dartmouth Water Utility had a couple of programs where they went around and over a couple of years, they replaced most of their lead service lines. However, at the time, typical with most water utilities, they replaced the public portion, and it was up to the homeowner to replace the private portion. And historically, in Halifax and most other places in North America, the amount of private side uptake has been minimal, and that's when we hear us use the term partial replacement. We're referring to when one portion of the service line has been renewed and the other portion remains at lead, as opposed to a complete replacement or a full renewal. In Halifax, since the 70s as well, Halifax Water has been replacing lead service lines under two programs. One was when the city, or HRM, was doing paving and road reconstruction projects. The water utility would get in just in advance of that program and replace all the public portions of the lead service lines with, once again, minimal uptake by the public or the private side on private lead service lines. And additionally, if anybody called us and said, I have a lead service line I'd like to deal with it, we would deal with the public portion as soon as the customer dealt with the private portion. We've also been doing a fair amount of research. It's been a major part of our research program since about 2010. I've got one graph to show you. It's the one with blue and red dots you see on the screen. This is research done by Dr. Ben Truman at Dalhousie University. This particular slide is one of the most seminal and widely repeated slides in lead research in North America. I've worked done here in Halifax. What it is showing you is the blue dots are full lead service line replacements. The red dots are partial lead service line replacements. And what is being graphed is the ratio of the lead levels in your drinking water before a renewal and 6 months after a renewal. And so what the graph is telling you, if the dot is below the diagonal line, that means the water quality improved, or there was less lead in the water after you replaced it. If the dot is above the diagonal line, that's telling you there's more lead in drinking water, in this case 6 months after you did the renewal. That's because lead appears as particles adhered to other substances in the service line, and disturbance of the service line mobilizes and frees lead. So what this is telling us is that there's no benefit to doing a partial replacement, and in many cases there's a significant impairment in drinking water quality by doing a partial replacement. So as a result of that, in 2012, Halifax Water took the position that we were no longer going to do partial replacements. This is protective of public health, but then it left us with the position of not being able to replace lead service lines with HRM paving projects because of the minimal level of private side uptake. So from the period of 2012 to about 2015, we were sitting here saying, okay, we can't do partial replacements. That's slowed down our program. We were doing about 50 replacements a year. It worked out to, it was about a 50-year program, minimal uptake, about 25 replacements per year. That way we were left with just customers approaching us, asking us to replace their lead service lines. At that time in the US EPA was looking at revising their lead and copper rule, and they convened a council called the NIDWAC, which stands for National Drinking Water Advisory Council. It was a panel of academics, water utility professionals, scientists, consultants, to advise the US EPA on how to upgrade the lead and copper rule. And when the NIDWAC came back, and they really challenged the water industry to say, you really need to take a different approach to lead service lines. Utilities should no longer tell the customer that what's on their side of the property line is their responsibility, that the utility really needs to work in partnership with their customers. And they also suggested that water sector policy should be erosion control treatment and full lead service line replacements. So that's been adopted by the American Waterworks Association, and it's a position of the Canadian Waterworks Association that utilities should work in partnership with their customers, do corrosion control treatment and full lead service line replacement only. So in the fall of 2016, we did a business plan for a modified approach to replacing lead service lines. We brought it to this board. That business plan was approved, and we launched into it. You can see on the slide there's also 5 pillars to the NIDWAC approach of inventory, lead service line replacement, communicating with customers, customer sampling, and corrosion control treatment. So just some highlights of what we've been doing since 2016. and 17. We have spent a lot of time on inventory. One of the problems with inventory on the public side of lead service lines, we have a reasonably good and complete inventory. On the private side, the inventory is very spotty. The utilities over the years took different levels of interest in whether the private customer was replacing their lead service line. And in fact, it's very easy for a customer to go to replace theirs and just not report it to the utility. So, and the various capital programs that have taken place over the years that have clouded that. So we've put a lot of work into inventory for the last few years. We've been working very hard on reintegrating with HRM paving. Part of our application that we'll talk about in a second to the URB for the rebate was based on an estimate that we would integrate 50% of our lead service line replacements with HRM capital programs, and because of the sharing of the restoration costs, that is the best way for us to do large volumes of lead service line renewals in a cost-effective manner. In 2016 in the fall, this board also approved an application to the URB, which was successful, to rebate 25% of the cost of private lead service line replacements to homeowners. And later on, a year later, the lateral loan program was approved, and lead service line renewal is eligible for that. We've also upgraded our education and awareness. We have videos. We do a lot of contact with customers. We've also developed a program where ourselves and the customer can use the same contractor to get a lead service line replacement done in a single day, just to ease the process for customers. Our program also includes a variety of things that are protective of public health. We no longer do partial lead service line replacements. When we identify high lead in a home and there's a impending lead service line replacement, we provide pitcher filters for customers so that they can look after themselves while they're waiting for the service line to be replaced. We've always had a pre-sample program in homes, and we've continued to optimize corrosion control treatment. So since 2016, we have a much better handle on our inventory, and you'll see on the graph to the upper right, in 2017 we were estimating that we had about 10,000 private lead service lines out there. That was largely based on utility experience in private side renewal, not just in Halifax, but across North America. And also our estimate that at one time there was probably about 15,000 lead service lines out there. So now, through our own work, we've gotten the number of public lead service lines out down from 2,000, 2,500 to the 1,500 to 2,000. But most importantly, we're quite comfortable that the private lead service line count out there is about 3,500. We've issued 176 rebates to homeowners. If you look at the graph on the bottom, you can see a bit of our history. We were doing about 50 per year under various programs. Between 2012 and 2013, we stopped doing partial replacements, so then we were only doing the ones where homeowners were approaching us, so the amount dropped off. We started our new business plan in 2016-17. The rebate program came out, the URB approved the rebates in 2017. We saw an uptick from that. We saw an uptick last year, and that was partially due to our AMI program, where we were installing meters in homes and identifying private side lead services that way. And then in 2019-20, this current year, we've seen a decline that we'll talk a little bit in lead service line replacement. So some of the current challenges we're dealing with, we've seen a decline this year. We believe, based on talking to other utilities and our experience, with time we'll see a continued decline. We believe in 2017, the uptake was, we would call it early adopters, people that were waiting for something like our rebate to act, and they jumped on it at the time. And we also saw that when we were installing water meters as part of our AMI program, part of the contractor's job is to identify lead service lines, and they would say to the customer, you have a lead service line, you need to deal with that, the utility will be contacting you. So we think that personal point of contact was important. But despite the uptick we had last year, only 4% of people that had that contact with the AMI contractor renewed their lead service lines. So now the AMI project is nearing its completion, and we don't have that point of contact. We've concluded over the last few years, and we've worked very closely with the people managing the capital program at HRM. It is extremely challenging to integrate with HRM. We cannot make homeowners renew their lead service lines. So both ourselves and HRM would like to, when HRM goes into paved street, for us to replace the vast majority of lead service lines. There's a variety of reasons that remain why customers don't replace lead service lines. Some just aren't concerned about it. The timing of the notice is challenging. Sometimes capital programs roll out in a way that people just don't have the time to prepare for a $4,000 or $5,000 investment. We've looked at lengthening somehow the notice problem, but then when you lengthen the notice period, you've created a concern in people, and they want to act. So then if they go and replace their lead service line before the paving project, we've lost the cost efficiency of that and increased disruption in the neighborhood. And this year we worked really hard with HRM. There were, of all the HRM paving projects, we identified 77 lead service lines. All 77 property owners had 3 points of contact from Halifax Water, and 5 people replaced their lead service line. So with the rebate, with the availability of the loan program, and 3 points of encouragement from us. So it is very difficult to integrate with HRM's paving program despite best efforts. And when we don't integrate, we've missed an opportunity to share in the restoration costs, minimize street cuts on freshly paved streets. So we believe there's barriers to us meeting our goal of replacing all the lead service lines over the next 30 years, and we need some additional tools to do that. So broadly, in talking to and looking at the programs of utilities across North America, there's really 2 ways available to us broadly that we can use to increase lead service lines. There's enhanced barrier removal or increasing incentives for people to replace lead service lines, or a regulatory approach, which is essentially the water utility telling people you must replace your lead service line and do it at your cost. The regulatory approach would require us to, we would do something like ban lead service lines and give people a certain amount of notice. And then at some point there would be enforcement, whether that was denial of service or us doing it and billing it back, something like that. And the incentive approach, essentially, as the recommendation suggests, involves the utility paying the full cost of private side lead service line renewal. So there's a variety of models out there in North America. We reviewed 50 utilities. What we're recommending is what we think is indicative of the best performing programs out there that we've identified. And also we looked at a variety of things like what's going to be most protective of public health for all the population. What's going to give the utility control the timeline, how fast or slow can we go? What's going to give us the best ability to integrate with HRM's paving program? We want to avoid fairness issues in places, particularly where there's disadvantaged communities. And of course, manage the utilities' administrative costs. We're really not favoring a regulatory approach, although that is an option. We just continue to think it'll be difficult to, I don't know about you, but I just don't have $4,000 or $5,000 sitting at home waiting to bury in my front lawn. I think most homeowners don't, and managing that notice will be difficult. Like we said, and then when we advise homeowners, if they take it really seriously, they're going to go early, and that's going to take away the cost savings. And if we're not doing it with integrated with HRM, we'll miss some of that cost savings. But also we believe we will encounter people that just can't or just aren't willing to replace their lead service line, and then we get into that enforcement world, whether it's denial of service or whether it's some type of fine or back charging people. So we're favoring the incentive approach. So the recommendation and the favored approach is full lead service line replacement with the utility covering the full cost of private lead service line replacement. From our review of utilities, we believe that the cost to the homeowner is the most significant barrier. The most successful programs out there are the ones paying the full cost. It does give us control over the timeline. Interestingly, there are 5 U.S. states currently that have legislation in front of the state legislatures asking to change their Public Utilities Act to allow utilities to do private side replacement out of rate-based funds. We think also this recommendation will give us the ability to target maybe sensitive communities that might appear to be left behind due to just how the HRM paving program rolls out, or to work with various groups where we might want to see some uptake of lead service line renewal. We'd have minimum enforcement requirements and probably the overall least administrative burden. As well, Halifax Water, we've worked very hard since 2012. We have a very good position in the water sector across North America. Right now, we believe the recommendation that we have before you is a trend that's clearly emerging amongst water utilities that are dealing with lead, and we would like to maintain our position there. Briefly, we've looked at a couple of alternatives, just partly to demonstrate that we've tried on a few. There are other options out there, but one alternative would be to pay the private side renewal only on HRM paving projects, and then it would be status quo, the 25% rebate in others. I think there's a couple points that may create fairness issues. I get my public health issue dealt with if my street's about to be paved. And also, you know, the homeowners and our customers are smart. If they put it, you know, once people understand how the program works, then I simply have to wait till my street's paved to get it looked after by the utility anyway, and the ultimate cost of doing that remains the same. Another alternative is we would pay for private side renewal while integrating with HRM, and then we would take the position that we're just banning lead service lines. And how that would work is perhaps over time we would roll out communities that we want to address, or when public health situations come up, we would give notice, probably 5 years, let's say, but make it a requirement for people at their costs to replace the lead service line with the rebate. This slide is looking at our current program with the proposed recommendation, and the cost that we're showing there is the cost that we have of dealing with the private side portion. And it's really just to show that compared to the program that was approved in 2016, we're not changing the utility outlay appreciably. So in 2017, there was an assumption of 10,000 lead service lines, 25% rebate on a private side average cost of 5,000, which works out to $12.5 million over the life of the program. Now, we're pretty comfortable that we're around 3,500 lead services. We know that the cost is now about $4,000. So 4,000 times 3,500 times the full cost is 14 million. So we're comparing 14 million in utility operating costs to 12.5 million over the 30-year life of the program. I'm not going to go through this slide in detail. This is just to lay out some of the assumptions we've dealt with in figuring out how this would work. But I would draw your attention to the fourth line down, which is the replacement per year, which is driving the length of the program. So we believe we'll settle out at a rate of about 60 replacements per year if we keep the program unchanged. The proposed option would allow us to do, typically we encounter 70 or 80 lead service lines in the scope of HRM paving projects, plus the 60 per year are the other ones that we encounter. Similar uptake for option 2, and there'd be with option 1, it would be simply paving projects only, plus the people approaches. And this is comparing the total cost of the program And once again, I draw your attention to what's important. The lower two lines of the table, not a huge difference in what the net present value of the four options are. And as well, it just highlights the difference in timeline depending on what tools are available to us. So, in summary, I think we've worked pretty hard. We've achieved some success with the program to date, particularly with inventory. We're getting good feedback from customers on our program, but there remain challenges, and we feel that without an enhancement to the program, as we're recommending today, we won't be able to meet the goal of replacing all lead service lines by 2050. Our application to the URB was projected on achieving, integrating half our lead service line replacements with HRM paving programs and realizing about a 30% cost saving in the public side from doing that. So it would be very difficult to achieve that costing assumption if we don't have the increased tools. And we strongly believe that what we're proposing is the direction that utilities in North America are going. So with that, this is a summary of the recommendation that you have to vote on, and we'll take any questions or continue discussion.
Thank you, Reed. And I'll ask for, Councillor Zarowski wants to speak, so could you put the motion on the floor? And if we
Yes.
want to entertain options 1 or 2, we can ask the tech people to put the screen just before you went to the summary back up on the
The
screen.
motion's already on the floor.
Yep. Right, you're in it.
Yeah, it's already on.
But
So
Councillor
I'll
Zarowski.
start off with a motion. But
No,
Halifax.
it's already
No, it's
already
done.
done.
Oh, it's already done?
You can start the question.
You can start the question.
Okay, wow. People sometimes really don't act in their own best interests. Lead is a horrible thing. I grew up with a neighbor who, this was 60 years ago, who was removing paint in one of the Trans-Canada shipping ships, and it was all lead-based, and he got lead poisoning and died a horrible death. And anybody that wants to dally with lead is really, I don't understand it. So I'm glad we have this, and thank you for the report. What I'm wondering, I've got one question and a couple of comments. The question is, in those areas where we've had the lead in the pipes, disturbing the pipes actually increases the amount of lead that goes in with partial replacement. Have we done any studies in and around the outflow of that as it goes into specific watershed areas, whether or not that has created problems in outflow areas? So I'm really curious about, the lead's got to wind up someplace if it goes. So that's my question. The second thing is in remediation, amelioration. In the 70s and 80s, we put electrical wiring in houses in Ontario with aluminum instead of copper, because it was cheaper and lighter and all that kind of stuff, and then we had to go back and replace everything. And I believe it was done at the cost of the utilities. So I'm wondering, have we looked at other replacement corporations that are public entities and how they dealt with things, and also the replacement of the formaldehyde insulation debacle that occurred also roughly in the same period, where formaldehyde was used, kind of a blown-in formaldehyde form that created all sorts of housing problems, and then we had to go into there. Have we looked at how they dealt with things in other jurisdictions? And waiting to 2050 before full replacement,
Crisis.
I hate to use the word crisis again, but lead in pipes and water is just, it's zero. And children have absolutely no tolerance for it at all. What we found is that all of our toxicity studies go out the window when we're talking about developing brains and nervous systems and growing bodies. So any resistance we have as adults to toxins, the levels just don't translate at all. So those are my comments, and that one question on the outflow.
Yeah, lead in effluent water has certainly not been part of our research program, and I'm really not aware, I don't know if you're, Wendy, of that being sort of an academic area in the drinking water business. So.
The only study I've heard of was there is a group out of the US that has correlated lead in drinking water to lead in biosolids. So I think a large portion of the lead in wastewater ends up in biosolids as opposed to within the waste stream.
Okay, well, that's not good either. So, and have we looked at other jurisdictions, companies that have had to do mass replacements of like aluminum wiring and formaldehyde?
Yeah, I understand. I mean, I think there was government grants involved along the way, but those were pretty much, now those are things that were restricted. They were not really utility issues. They were restricted to the private property of the house. So they were largely, over time, the responsibility of the building owner or the property owner, but I also believe there was government programs, assistance grants and that along the way. We have, I keep mentioning the 50 utilities. There's a lot of sharing in the North America, and I keep referring to North America. The United States is ahead of Canada in this. There's probably only 2 or 3 Canadian utilities that are at the position Halifax Water is. So a lot of our examples come from the United States. But there's really there's 50 utilities we've examined in detail. There's everything from rebates. One that comes to mind is Indiana American Water. It is a large investor-owned and regulated utility that has utilities all across the state of Indiana, 1.5 million customers. They are doing that at utility expense as an investor-owned utility. There's a lot of utilities that offer different flavors of a rebate like we offer, but we're finding similar experience anecdotally from talking to those other utilities that there's an initial uptake, and then the city of Boston, for instance, doubled their rebate from $1,000 to $2,000 with no increase on uptake, and they've now concluded that they need to pay the full cost too.
And just to follow up on that, it's good to hear that it's good and bad, that other jurisdictions are able, are something we can learn from. What about in terms of sales of these homes? Is this something that home inspections would be looking at?
Yeah, we have done a lot of work working with the real estate sector, and we do try to communicate to home inspectors. We firmly believe that the best time to deal with it is at the point of sale. Because the cost is not huge. Into a 30-year mortgage, it's I don't know, $2 a month or something.
That's exactly where I was going to.
The disclosure process now is controlled by the real estate vendors sector, the disclosure form. It's challenging to get them. They're interested in learning about lead. It's a little more challenging to get them to consider.
That would be under provincial jurisdiction, would it not?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
No, I think we'll continue to work in that regard. It's going to be a bit of a road to get to that point.
As always.
And the challenge there as well is ensuring that the prospective buyer understands that there's a lead service before the sale of the home. Because having that notification after the sale of the home is probably the worst time for that to happen.
Maxed out on your mortgage.
Exactly.
Usually
Absolutely, absolutely.
And your last comment was, can we go faster? 2050 recommendation was based on the MIDWAC recommendations. So understanding that we can't do it all in 1 year, that sort of the industry approach, largely in the US, was let's do this over 30 years. We would like to do this as quickly as possible. You saw in the slide I compared the finances. We've now changed the status quo to 2063 because of slow uptake. What we believe is the recommendation we have before you gives us control of the timing. I will say, however, that the most cost-effective way and least amount of public disruption is for us to integrate with HRM paving programs. So our intent would be to integrate 100% with HRM paving programs where lead service lines exist. And then we would work for opportunities to expand the program beyond that, just with the understanding is there's more public disruption and greater cost to the utility to be doing them outside of HRM programs.
And I just wanted to mention, since we've got the media here, that probably the story is the fact that individuals don't act in their best interests. And I would use that as a headline, if any media is listening. People don't act in their own best interests, and the uptake is the problem. Thank you.
I'll just be glad to have a headline.
Lead
Anyone
line.
else?
Madam Chair?
Councillor Hensby?
In regards to if we move forward and take the carrot approach and just be responsible from the road straight to the meter, and take it over all, I'm kind of curious, the ones that have already had it done already, will we be rebating them or forgiving the loan, or those who've already replaced their lines, would they get compensation for having done that?
No, they would not, and that comes from well-established precedent with the Nova Scotia Utility and Review Board. So the first rule is that there's no retroactive rate making. So we can't go back and reimburse something because we can't go back and adjust our revenue requirements and build it into the rates we've already collected, and it's unfair to shift it forward to new customers. The second piece is that whenever changes are made to the regulations, and generally this is true with most types of regulation for regulated entities as well as provincial and federal regulations, changes are made prospectively. So you don't go back and retroactively apply a regulation. And that's been consistent with any regulatory changes Halifax Water has ever made.
Do we know the magnitude of how many people A, either applied for a cost-sharing program, or B, had replaced it themselves? Do we know, we have a magnitude of how much money that might be?
Well, bear in mind that people have been replacing lead service lines
Since the
probably
70s.
since the 70s.
That's what
We
he
would
said.
have incomplete information on that.
I was thinking more of when we initiated our program replacing our own lines, public concern. I was using that as our start date, not prior to.
We have good statistics, I'd say, from 2016 forward.
Yeah, and I think to the councillor's question, it wasn't our presentation that we've awarded 176 rebates. So there's 176 people who got 25% rebates on the program.
And how many people applied for the loans?
Only, we've had 4 loan applications, and I think maybe only one of them was a lead service line. The loan application applies to other types of lateral issues like cross connections.
So would it be so hard to compensate, just write that off?
Again, that would be something that we're actually not permitted to do under the Nova Scotia.
Plastics, since it's a nominal 1 or 2 customers, I think that's more of a journal entry, in my opinion, than to have to get permission from URB.
Yeah. We could certainly, when we bring forward our application to the Nova Scotia Utility and Review Board, as part of the rate application, we'll be bringing forward a rate application that talks about different things going on within our rates. We could take that into consideration when we bring forward write-off for bad debt.
Thank you.
Colleen?
You spoke to fairness a few times, but as you think of a number of $3,500, quantity of 3,500, have you thought any more about the prioritization outside of the HRM projects in the event that the uptake becomes larger as people realize that they have a responsibility as well? Can you talk to the prioritization a bit more?
Yeah, so we have looked at a lot of other utility models, and there are a lot of things that we can go off of, and 2 ways people or utilities generally target it is either through high density areas. So if we have a street that we know we have a lot of lead service lines, we can go in and target that street as a program. And the other is more of a triage system. So if people want their lead service line replaced, they apply to have it replaced, and then we would have some sort of a questionnaire or a triage system to understand whether they're a high-risk home, whether they have children in the home, or they're planning on having children, and kind of prioritize the lead service line replacement based on risk.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
No, I've got a couple.
Ted?
First of all, thanks for the presentation. I was really happy to see this on the agenda, that we're going to be asking the URB to pay for all these. I had my utility line replaced about 2 summers ago. I got the rebate. It's really expensive to do that. It's really annoying. Disruptive. I can kind of see why people wouldn't want to go ahead and do that, but it's also very important, and I think a lot of people just aren't able to do that. So I totally support this and option 1. One thing that struck me was that there's a lot fewer lines, lead lines out there than we thought. So that was good. You got that from all the meter replacement projects going into everybody's house and verifying?
Yeah, I'll let Wendy speak to it, but we've got a variety of sources, and in fact, I believe there's 8 different sources we check now. If a customer calls and says, I have a lead service line, to make a decision. But AMI provide a lot of data. We've also been doing a lot of what they term the industry as potholing, or taking a hydro excavator and digging a small diameter hole right at the service box, so at least we see the service on both sides of the service box. You want to speak to some of the other things we've been doing?
Yeah, so I think AMI has been the biggest driver for reducing those inventory numbers on the private side, and it's largely, in some areas, we really don't have a lot of records on private material, and so we had a lot of services listed as unknown material, and we included those in the estimate as a worst case of the lead picture back in 2017. So that 10,000 included a lot of unknowns, and with identification of lead at the meter, we've been able to positively identify some of those and reduce that number of unknowns. So I would say that's been our biggest impact to inventory so far. And then we're also going through, as Reed mentioned, for each individual service within our lead service line boundary, we're looking at about 6 or 7 pieces of information, comparing notes, and we have a process flow that we go through to identify the service material. And so we're seeing some changes and reductions in inventory that way.
That's really quite favorable for us, isn't it? Okay. And as a result of that, I guess the costs associated with this is going down quite a bit. We had already asked the URB for permission. Is that correct?
We have asked the URB for permission for the current program for rebates and for the lead lateral program. We have not done a rate application since we got those programs approved. So regardless of what option you choose, there's a water rate increase coming next year. Partially, one factor in it will be the lead service line program in its current form, though that's not the most material thing that will be driving any changes in our rates. So the URB is going to be asked to approve at some future point next year, adjusting our water rates to include whatever our lead service line rebate program is at that point in time.
Right now it's around 12.5 million. Is that just the private portion and there's public as well?
The 12.5 million is what would be spent on 25% rebates if we were doing 10,000 private services.
And that's the only portion that's included in the rate? Or is there more that I'm not seeing?
There's
There's
also
more.
capital cost of the public side. Is included.
Okay, that's a lot more.
Yeah, we've got about 1,900 now really, but the cost is much higher. It's because of the paving and curbs and sidewalks and public trees. It's about $10,000 to do a single public rebate. It's about $4,000 to do a single private.
So overall, the impact of replacing it at our cost, including the private and public portion, how much of it are we asking the URB to look into?
It would be on that basis, it would be on average. Yeah, do you have that number at hand? But it's 1,900 times 10,000 plus 3,500 times 4,000.
And the capital component is already within our rates to the extent that there's been an existing capital program for lead service line replacements for a number of years for the public side.
Yeah, we don't anticipate changing the.
So this seems like a pretty small amount then.
Yeah, I think it's a benefit the utility's been replacing lead service lines since the 70s, and the most expensive part is on the public side. And our number is really not that bad, so and it's a real cost, but it's it's not a.
I'll say with the public benefit, I mean, it's pretty much an easy decision. Okay. I want to add to what Richard Jarowski asked about the timeline.
Mm-hmm.
And if I look at the chart that you gave us, I think it said With the status quo, it would be 2063 for program end date. And then if we go with the proposed option, go down to 2039. That's accurate.
Yeah, that is based on, the level of paving program that HRM rolls out and the average of private-led service lines that we encounter in that paving program. And so essentially the program would be done when HRM gets the paving program, plus some allowance for just extras we do for other programs. It would be within our control to ramp that up or down. However, the most cost-effective and orderly way to do it is integration with HRM.
Okay. I'm curious, what is our ability then to ramp it up something faster? Like say in a 10-year timeline, and what would be the cost implications or other implications that we have to consider if we set that as our goal?
I mean, the total overall program costs would remain the same. We honestly haven't done a lot of analysis of, 2030, 2025, that type of thing. But, the overall program cost would be the same. We would have some things like the administrative costs.
Over a shorter period of time.
Yeah, and the other thing we would have to check in and come back is, the shorter we make it, the higher the proportion of the higher the proportion of public services that get done outside of HRM paving programs.
That's where I was going with this, because there's higher costs associated with that.
So we've not done that analysis.
No, but we generally, in looking at our costs, we would see about a 30% savings if we were to integrate with HRM just on the sharing of the reinstatement fees. So if we did anything outside of that, we would lose that 30% cost savings on the public side. We would probably see some cost savings because we would be doing larger scale projects and we'd have the economy of scale, but it wouldn't be that 30% savings. But you would have a reduced administrative program cost if you reduce the timeline as well.
If we look at the motion, if I said, could we adjust that, instead of saying the goal being 2050, if we said 2039 or as fast as possible, would that be in line with what you're suggesting? I might make that motion to change it, but I have a few more questions.
You want to pick a specific date or just endeavor to be sooner or something?
I'd say 2039 or sooner, based on what the suggestion in the option.
So we have an amendment. Is there a
Second.
Seconder for Councilor Zelke. Any discussion on the amendment?
Get her done.
And so the amendment's been passed, so now we're on the amended motion. Is there any further questions on the amended motion? Councilor Hensby?
Just in regards to trying to coordinate with HRM street paving and stuff, I assume we have a more accurate detail of where these lead lines need to be replaced at. I assume we can overlap that with our street index, paving management strategy and stuff, and try to collaborate as much as possible. But I'm just kind of curious, maybe with Brad here, is there an opportunity where we can look at postponing some road work to get these guys lined up, or vice versa? Just kind of curious of, because one's going to drive the other. If we want to go and replace all the lead lines, that's going to accelerate our paving program significantly. And I just want to know if there's a way that we could collaborate them together, but not drive the
You've
horse.
been very quiet, Brad. You want to respond?
No, there's a number of factors here to consider with both accelerating the paving program and working outside of the paving program. I guess accelerating the paving program, of course, that's the decision of Halifax Regional Council. Obviously, more information to follow on that as you get briefings on your paving condition and index, and of course, so accelerating the lead program will accelerate your paving program to a significant degree, and therefore your cost on the tax rate. The other key factor to remember here is quality of life and construction. This is mainly in the peninsular area, which is already under significant construction. So that's a good news, is that there's lots of opportunity to do these projects. The bad news is it's becoming increasingly difficult to manage our major capital projects, such as the Windsor Street Exchange that's forthcoming, Cogswell, all of the AAA bike network, and so Spring Garden Road reconstruction. So all of these things are adding up to create a very construction-intensive atmosphere on the peninsula. So these are some things we have to consider. The other thing is also we have to consider is that Halifax Water is not the only utility in the ground. HRM has to align with several partners whenever we're going through road construction. So it's a delicate balancing act that we do with the paving program, largely driven though by Halifax Regional Council's ability to advance the paving program with the tax rate. So with all those things, obviously if the decision of the board today is to move forward with this, obviously this would become a significant priority, not the only priority, but a significant priority in steering the program. And it's you know, the way we line up the streets. That said, there's also a cost to prematurely going in and life cycling the asphalt. And we're seeing that more and more as we move forward with the IMP, the Integrated Mobility Plan. We are starting to life cycle a lot of pavement well ahead of its time, and that's increasing the cost of paving as well. So, long-winded story, so there's a lot of factors that go into this. So as this unfolds and this decision is taken today, we would need to come back to Halifax Regional Council with kind of what are the overall impacts to the paving program, because it wouldn't be surprising to Halifax Regional Council that there'll be obviously a lot of pressure on the paving program to go in certain locations as soon as possible. So with that, more information to follow.
In regards to going on to private property stuff and replacing the lead lines there, what expectations are going to be for restoration of the property as before state and after state in regards to landscaping, or perhaps some driveways may need to be tore up, or some house decks might be in the way of where the connection to the home may be underneath some other infrastructure. What is the anticipated policy? Are we just going to go in there and try to minimize as much interruption as possible, or are we going to just the hell with it, we're going to replace it, and you can deal with the consequences of cleaning up the mess of landscaping afterwards?
And we do a small bit of that now, and I didn't bring it up in the presentation, but part of what the URB approved in 2017 for us, along with the rebate, is when if we go along because of, let's say, a water main break or maintenance program, we disturb a lead service, then you know, the homeowner, even though they've got a lead service line, they're in a stable situation and we've destabilized it. So in those cases, we've been, it's been the utility's responsibility to replace the service as soon as possible, all the way to the water meter at our cost. So we've been doing that. Over the last 2-3 years, we've probably done 10, 15 of those, perhaps. Homeowners have been quite cooperative. Our approach has been to do all the restoration. Our loan program and our rebate program is maxed out on a basis of $10,000 per service. The average cost of replacing a private service is about $4,000. And so I think the $10,000, the impression behind that is to give it, it's to allow for more expensive private renewals, but still allow some point of reasonableness. So our intent would be, when we do the application to the URB, to deal with all restoration conditions up to a point of reasonableness. So, you know, if somebody's built a swimming pool over the top of their service, I'm not sure that's the utility's cost to bear. So I think our approach would be to totally look after the restoration up to some amount that, you know, that captures the 90-95 percentile of restoration situations.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Just 2 points I'd like to clarify for me, please. One, you mentioned a couple times about identifying a targeted approach for sensitive communities. I was wondering if you could explain a little bit more about what exactly that means.
And so that was when I was speaking to Colleen's point earlier about sort of high-risk populations. That would be targeting daycares, targeting families that have small children in the home or are of childbearing age.
How do you do that? So these are projects that are outside of the HRM paving schedule? Okay.
It would be, so it would be either driven from the homeowner contacting us saying, I want my lead service line renewed, and we would put them within that sort of triage program. Or we would probably have some sort of outreach trying to get those customers to contact us that are within those sensitive populations.
Okay, then the next one would be sort of hypothetical, we announced that we're going to be replacing these things free of charge, and then everybody starts calling us and saying, I want my street done now. I don't want to wait for the paving, which might not be for 10 years. How do we handle those situations?
Yeah, I mean, that is something that we have to put a lot of thought into, and I think even with all the money in the world, for a lot of reasons that Brad suggested, we can't do them all in year one. I think for our customers at large and for the rate base at large, the most cost-effective and least disruptive way to do it is in coordination with the paving program. There's a rational basis to that program, and it can be somewhat predictive of when you will get to your street and do it. We're still prepared to deal with people one-offs. If you're not prepared to wait for the HR program, we will work with you.
Do we ever say that you're not scheduled for this year or next year or the year after, so you have to pay for it yourself?
Yeah,
If you want to get fast
those are
track.
considerations we have to work out. I mean, you're right, there will be a lot of people that will potentially call us.
So you might be busy taking calls.
They might, yeah.
I mean, that's probably the biggest downfall of this approach is managing public expectations.
And I will say as well, there's a number of cases, where people in our current program, where for whatever reason they're just not able or unwilling to act. If there was a lead service line, there was high lead. We do, lead can be managed in the home. The right solution is always replace the lead service line. But we have flushing instructions, ways to use water in the home to minimize that exposure, and we do provide filters in some of those cases. So we don't see anybody being totally left behind as a result of managing the
Thank you very much.
But to that point where you say filtration, a lot of people are told that filtration and osmosis takes care of it.
There are, yeah.
And therefore they don't want to necessarily have the expense of having the lead pipes replaced, because they figure they're protecting their vulnerable children with that.
Yeah, and you can manage, the word I used was manage lead in the home. You're not going to eliminate it. It's a tricky thing in the water sector to be given point-of-use filters to homes. At maintenance, we give a year's supply when we give one out of cartridges. The cartridges have to be replaced. So then you're leaving that responsibility to manage that on the homeowner. So I would never see that as being a temporary or a permanent solution, but it is a means for people to manage it for a term period.
I don't see any further questions, so
Questions?
all in favor?
Aye.
Contrary-minded, motion is passed. Ted, you had put 5.1 on, and I think you made your amendment. Is that,
Yep. Oh, no, well, this is regarding, this is separate.
okay, you're on.
I was hoping that somebody,
5.I, I said 5I, this is the disclosure of lead service line and testing information that you added to the agenda.
it was really just, there's an information report,
Mhm.
and I was just wondering if somebody could give us just a presentation about this, and maybe ask some questions afterwards.
So, in a nutshell, this is here because we wanted to inform the board that we're really changing our past practice on how we've disclosed lead service lines, and wanted to let the board know in a clear way how and who you're going to be making disclosures to, and give you some assurance that we had checked with the privacy officer. We'd also had some conversations with the officer of medical health to make sure that we came to a well-reasoned consensus. And in the past, we treat customer information and information on what type of lateral they have generally as something that we would disclose only to the property owner or the customer of record. Not saying that that might not have always been the case. There might have been one or two that would have slipped through the cracks, but generally laterals, we don't disclose the type of material to anybody other than the property owner. In response to a lot of the recent inquiries around lead, we've actually had tenants who are living in rental properties or in apartment buildings calling us and asking about their service lines. That left us in a bit of a quandary as to what is our obligation. You know, people do have some right to know how safe the water is they're drinking. And what should we be informing people with respect to their lead service line? So a group of staff got together and worked on these positions. Wendy and Reed can speak to them in detail if you want to go into it in detail. But we're basically proposing, well, we've made the decision, it's one that the general manager's authorized, that we're disclosing more information than we have in the past. And we're going to be responsive to any of the questions coming forward from people who are in rental situations on their service lines. But we are being mindful of the fact that the property owner also has a right to know what's going on. So we would be going back to the property owner and letting them know that the inquiry is there and this is the response. And then we would be letting the renter know in almost, I won't say it's necessarily simultaneous, but it will be a closely coordinated release of information to both sides.
I'd say, if there's been a lead test done, the site will have to have that information as well, or they can do the lead test.
Historically, we have not. That may change.
Historically, I mean, as Kathy alluded to, we've gotten, since our program's been running 2 to 4 lead calls per day, because we try to deal with property owners, it's really been a very, very small number of tenants up until recently that called us. So we've been able to manage through that. We've gotten the information to the people by working with the property owner. It was the response to the recent articles in the Star and the Global News about lead that, literally our call volume and website hits exploded overnight, and a surprisingly high proportion, close to half, were people that were not the property owner tenants typically. So that caused us to look at that. I mean, we've always been, and most utilities are, very transparent about water quality. And we put it on our website, and we tell water quality information to anybody who will ask. A lot of their consumers are not our customers. But the difference with lead, water quality is dependent on the building that you're in when you're consuming it. So it makes the water quality dependent on the characteristics of private property. So the intent of the approach we're taking now is we're going to respect whatever private property rights are there for the property owner, but at the same time disclose the information on whether there's a lead service or not, or what is the lead concentration in the water in the home to the person that's consuming it, if it's a tenant.
And we will provide test kits, I believe.
Yes.
Also.
If you're finished, Ed?
Finished, thank you.
I was glad Councillor Farquhar brought this forward. First of all, I wanted to commend Halifax Water for pursuing this, since they continue to focus on the public health of everyone, not just their specific customers. So I'm really glad you found a way to be able to provide the information to tenants. In your research, did you come up with any path forward for the tenants? I thought it was good context in your statistics of how many property owners aren't necessarily uptaking on the replacement. Was there any direction on what a tenant can do if their landlord was not pursuing the replacement in an expeditious manner?
I would say we haven't really gotten to that point yet. We have seen landlords that do renew upon understanding what the lead levels are, and we've seen the opposite as well. So I think that's something we're going to have to work through, but our goal is to provide that information to both parties to be able to make those decisions.
Right now, we would not have an enforcement tool. The only enforcement tool or regulatory tool that may exist would be under the Residential Tenancies Act. Not to say that we couldn't look at our own regulations and request for additional regulatory authority to, for instance, go down the denial of service route if a replacement's not done within a certain period of time.
It really is a Residential Tenancies Act at that point, and I think part of our approach is the solution rests with the property owner, if it's a landlord, and we need to work with them, so we need to be transparent with both parties, because just like any other customer, we want to encourage the landlord or the property owner to do the right thing. And I think in extreme cases, the medical officer of health is prepared to act if there's just some egregious situations.
But that being said, if the proposed recommendation goes through the OARB, then that would become part of the triage system that we developed.
Just a quick question, so if a lead testing kit's giving out and lead is found to be in that area, and there might be some delay of time of replacing the line, are we also giving them extra filtration devices?
So we provide the filter kits when there is an intent to renew. Speaking to your point earlier about using filtration as a way to mitigate the issue and not replacing. So our program provides the filter when a permit is taken out with the intent to renew the service in order to manage the increased lead that happens during the construction phase.
And that would be to our customers of record. I do not believe we're providing filters to people in
We do.
apartment
We
buildings.
do. If there's a lead service on a property and there's 3 or 4 units, each unit would get a filter kit.
If they're doing the renewal.
If they're doing the
intent
renewal.
to renew.
Yes.
That's the third class.
And do we have a statistic of how many of those kits we've given out?
We do have that number. It was in our UARB report in June. I don't have it off the top of my head. But it's a couple of hundred per year.
Okay.
Any other questions? So I'm getting a visual of Clyde Street myself, and in a heritage district, and a whole block was redeveloped. As one to assume that the lead pipes in the street and in that building are all gone.
I don't know the specifics of Clyde Street, but under our current program, the probability is they have not all gone unless that
Correct.
street was dealt with years back.
Because I'm just thinking from a resident in an apartment building that is new, they will make the assumption that there is no lead in their drinking water.
If, the probability is, not knowing the details of Clyde Street, if there was a water main renewal, let's say since the 80s on Clyde Street, the public lead services would have been replaced. The private, the probability is maybe 10-20% of the people have since renewed the private portion.
I just think it's a great opportunity when they're being developed, when the street's being torn up, when the sidewalk is being widened, that is not, sort of, may not be considered at this point in time. So thank you for putting the information report on the floor. So there was no motion, so we will go on to number 8. We're here to do business.
Okay, item 8 is.
But it is
the,
noon, so
It'll be fast.
it'll be fast.
Item 8 is the
Wilson.
culmination of the enterprise risk management journey the board's been on. The board has approved 2 years ago a risk management framework. You've done many workshops to identify the risks for the organization. Most recently at the last meeting, you approved risk tolerance and criteria, and this is the final piece and really the public piece. It's just what our corporate enterprise risk management policy will be. It's the final step we need approved, so we have a document that speaks to the corporate position on enterprise risk management that we can then use next year to start rolling it out to staff.
Anybody want to put the motion on the floor?
I move that the Halifax Water Board approve the attached enterprise risk management policy.
Second.
Second, Councilor Zarowski. Any further discussion? Seeing none, ask for the question. Question's been called for. All in favor?
Aye.
Unanimous. Motion's passed. Looks like my agenda's done.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
I call for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
We are adjourned.
Just a reminder, we have a chili lunch going on next door. If anyone's interested.
Exactly, that's the chatter.
So,
Good, thank you.
so David, as a recycled division, do you like the new format?